Welcome to the Who I Became podcast.
I'm joined today by James McGarvey from the Church Safety Guys. Good afternoon, James.
Hey, Simon. How are you today?
Well, it was really a struggle for me not to introduce you and get your name wrong, because if anyone cannot say Osamoh, it is James McGarvey.
It is me, and having the last name McGarvey, I think I've heard it any possible variation, which I'm sure you have with your last name as well too. But
yeah, I'm sure McGravy is probably the most common one. That's where my brain goes to, and I'm thinking I'm going to introduce this guy. So
very much so, very much so.
You'll get that. My name is not the easiest to say, and you've only been trying to practice for a year, so you'll get there. 2 or 3 years, you're there. Well, James, I'm really pleased that you're joining me today for Who I Became, and I know you've got a very interesting background, and you're one of these people that gives so much of yourself away. And when I see people do that, I'm always intrigued to sort of learn more about their stories. And I own your book, but I've got to be honest, I couldn't find your book today to show. But you are the author of the 31-day devotional for church safety leaders, and you are the co-host of one of the largest church safety groups on Facebook. So thank you for everything that you do.
Well, I appreciate the recognition. That's not why I do it, but it's nice that every once in a while that's recognized.
So you like the pat on the back, but it's not why you do it. I like it. You're
Correct.
Trying to say that with a straight face, and that's good. But maybe tell us, how did you get into sort of not so much church safety, but how did you get into starting this group on Facebook?
Sure. Well, honestly, at the time, and we're in our fourth year now, but honestly, I went to several conferences. I had talked to Jimmy Meeks and Carl Chen about the possibility, the idea of maybe doing something on social media to reach out to people. But when I went on social media, much of what I found was it really was geared more towards a tactical approach of, this is the right way or the wrong way to do something. And I didn't find a whole lot of substance with the groups that were out there. I really prayed about it, but I looked at it as, I want to share some of my best practices over the years with starting a safety team with other churches that maybe they're going through similar things. And the big thing is, once you've established a team, you have to minister to those individuals. As you lead that team, you have to operate it on a discipleship level. And so I wasn't seeing that. I wasn't seeing any groups where it seemed like we were building each other up and encouraging each other. And so I started the church safety and security group. I think originally we had about 100 people in it. And now almost, just after 4 years later, we're actually over 2,600 now. So God has blessed that ministry and has really grown it far beyond what I thought in the beginning, for sure.
Yeah, and there's a lot of work, and I've appeared on your show a few times. There's a lot of work and dedication that goes into it. So it's always great to see those that do volunteer work, do well and bless other ministries. But outside of church safety, Paul, what do you do for work?
Well, I work for the U.S. Defense Department. You're
going to go secret squirrel on me now, are you? I can't talk about it, or I have to kill you. That's normally what follows when someone says I work for Ministry of Defense or something like that.
Oh, yeah, I do. And when you hear that knock on your door in about 5 minutes, when your wife answers the door, there'll be men in black suits with black Suburbans parked out in your driveway. No, what I do is I do contract investigation and purchasing for the Defense Department. So anytime the Defense Department needs to purchase something in my division, it's particularly for vehicles, and so if somebody, say the Army needs a part for their MRAP or their Humvee or something of that nature, they reach out to us, and we operate much in logistics, much like a distribution center. And so what I do is I I review contracts and I go back and make sure that the company is really who they say they are, that they have the capability of producing, and then certainly that we're looking at U.S. based companies first to supply that need for the warfighter. So it's fun. It's interesting to me. Every day is a little bit different. I've been involved in some fairly large investigations with the FBI and the ATF. But then I've also had the opportunity to make a difference with, ships that were getting ready to be deployed, and they were waiting for, one specific thing. And, I was able to get that so that they could be deployed and go into the field. So to me, it's very rewarding, but I enjoy it.
And it must be a challenging role, because a leader often has to lead with no's, or a leader grows by their no's and not with yeses. So when you're in a due diligence sort of procurement type role, I'm sure no must have to come out of your lips occasionally, and you're the bad guy.
It does, and I do, and maybe that's where my love for the topic of de-escalation has come into effect. But we had one quick story. We had a company approach us and ask if they could manufacture ballistic glass for MRAPs. Basically, we needed a supplier for bulletproof glass, basically, and this was a new company, and we had never purchased anything from them. And so I started doing some research, and the location that we were given as far as an address goes was something similar to that of a Panera Bread. And so, looking through this, I'm skeptical. I'm like, wait a second here. I don't think a bakery can produce bulletproof glass, but if you've ever seen, or any of your listeners have ever seen the movie War Dogs, it's not a great movie, but that is very similar to what I do. Is that the basis of that movie? And that movie is a true story, unfortunately. And sometimes, some purchases the government does get taken, and they don't typically take real kindly to that. And usually when something like that happens, then, the FBI, the ATF, other government agencies decide to step in and right that wrong. So,
well, before you say something that you're not allowed to, and the men in suburbans turn up at my house, we'll move on to a different issue. But I want to talk about, you spend a lot of time in sort of volunteerism around EMS and law enforcement.
Sure.
And I know there's a story that starts when you were 10 or 11, that your grandma fell down the stairs, and that really changed your sort of career path, you might say. Do you mind sort of sharing that story?
Sure.
About when your grandma fell down the stairs?
Absolutely. So my family originally was from New Jersey, and when I was little, we moved to New Hampshire, mostly because my dad was an engineer, but he took a low-paying job and basically wanted to move because he felt like where we were living was becoming unsafe, and he wanted to get out of the city. He wanted to be more in the country and raise our family in the country, and so. So we moved up to New Hampshire. There were some friends we had up there, and there was a period of time in getting settled. And I grew up in. It's funny because a lot of my background is very similar to Paul's. When I heard that story, and I was like, "Wow, that's crazy."
I should say Paul Buckner is your co-host on the Church Safety Guys.
Paul Buckner's. So I'm sorry. So we got established, and there were different life experiences. We had the opportunity to live on a dairy farm. So, I would help my dad take care of animals and work on tractors and plow and that sort of thing. And I was always comfortable either wearing a tie or wearing jeans and a t-shirt. It didn't matter to me. But when I was about 10 or 11, my grandfather passed away. And so my dad didn't like my grandmother living in New Jersey by herself. And so he asked her to come live with us for a bit. And I think she lived with us for about a year and a half. And during that time, of course, there was a lot. My grandmother was a very headstrong Catholic woman. And there was always she did not want to live with us. She wanted to live in New Jersey with her friends and church and everything. And so there was always interesting situations, but she would do our laundry often, and our laundry was down, our machines were down in the basement. And so one day she walked down there, and I think she missed the last 2 steps and ended up falling. And when she fell, she kind of fell straight down. She didn't have an opportunity to catch herself, and she banged her head on the concrete wall as she went down. And so she had started screaming. She was screaming hysterically. And of course, my mom ran down there to see what was happening, what was going on. Didn't really know what happened. We heard the noise of her falling. And then so she yelled to my older brother at the time. That the 2 of us were really, it was just the 3 or 4 of us at home. So she yelled to him, go call an ambulance. And he ran to the phone and picked up the phone. And of course, this is showing my age, but 911 wasn't existent then. We had to ring up the local.
You are old.
ring up the local squad. But an ambulance was dispatched, and the rescue squad showed up, and the people, and of course, there are people I don't know, and they're banging on the door, and they're stomping in, and they're carrying gurneys and bags and all this stuff. And, being 10 or 11, I was really overwhelmed. I didn't know anything. I didn't know, if my grandmother was going to be okay or not. And so a lady came in by the name of Dee Campbell, and I found out later she was actually the rescue captain. So she was in charge, but she came in, she walked past me and stopped and turned around to me, and she kind of looked at me, and she put her hand on my arm, and she said, "Honey, what's wrong?" And I said, "Well, and I was trying not to cry, or I was trying to hold it together, and I said, my grandmother fell down the stairs, and I don't know, if she's going to be okay." And so without saying a word, and I had never seen this lady ever before. I had no idea. We had just moved into that house, and so I didn't know anyone. And so she reached out and put her arm around me and brought me in and just hugged me, and actually just held me for a few minutes. And she said, "Honey," she said, "your grandmother's going to be fine. We're going to take care of her. And, don't worry, it's going to be okay." And so, that was just crazy impactful to me. And so I stepped back, and she carried on. She went about helping the squad load her into the ambulance. And of course, back then, I don't know if you've ever seen the show Rescue or Emergency, with Rescue 51, but that was really the day when an ambulance was just a glorified taxi to take someone to the hospital. There was very, very little medical equipment on the ambulance. And so they transported her, and of course she was back home that night. But what was interesting to me about it was there were it really made me think 2 things. The first thing was I felt very unprepared. And in the situation, my dad was always very much be prepared for the unexpected. And so, he would teach me how to do everything like, change a tire, when your tire goes flat on the road, so that you knew how to handle things and be prepared for that. And I wasn't prepared for that. And that really hit me hard. And the other thing was that, I realized that I didn't like the fact medically that I didn't know how to help her. And I kind of felt like just an idiot standing there, even though
11, Paul. I'm James. Sorry, give yourself some credit. You're 11.
Yeah, well, that's true. But at the same time, it was just the fear of not knowing how to handle it. And that impacted me because, as we were talking earlier today, I like to be able to step in now because of that and say, okay, this is how we handle this stressful situation. And so that really pushed me to have an interest in EMS. And, I just started, scooping up everything I could find. The Red Cross had books back from the 70s that they were still selling, so I'd go to a yard sale and find one and read it and, practice bandaging and doing all this stuff. And, every waking moment that I had, I'd go to the fire station and look at the rescue truck, help with the fire trucks, that sort of thing. And so it really just, my love for that just continued until the point where I was, old enough to get the official training and help them and do things. And at that point I had really gotten to meet people, and so they knew who I was. They were like, "Oh yeah, that's that kid that always, he's been hanging out at the fire station for the last 2 years." But the cool thing about it was that probably close to 8 years later, I was able, because I worked for an ambulance company and did some dispatching and volunteered with that department, I was able to actually go back and review all of the documents from 8 years before that showed, this paramedic was on this call, this person was the driver, and I knew them. They didn't remember me, but I was able to go back to them and thank them and say, Mrs. Campbell, what you did really changed my life. And that really cemented my love for being able to look at a situation, articulate it, and try and help someone when they were in a place where, they were overwhelmed to do something themselves.
Yeah, for you, that must be quite a passionate moment to, be 10 or 11 to see this event, that your grandma's fallen down the stairs. You don't know quite what's happening. There's a lot of strange people coming in the house. And then to have that passion and the desire and to become an EMS and go through some very different training, and then to find the people that actually helped your family and then to thank them, that must have been a great experience to go through. And they were like, well, who is this young guy? Or you realise, Paul, I keep calling you Paul for some reason. You and Paul Butler, you're all in one. I keep seeing you both faces. But it must have been thinking, James, we go to like 4,000 calls a year, calls for service. We can't remember everyone. But I mean, what did they take away from it when you were stood in front of someone that says, 10 years ago, you came to my house and I'm here because of you? What did you really see in their emotion?
Well, it's kind of like, it's interesting. It's kind of like when you go up and you thank a veteran, often. And that was one thing. My dad was a veteran. I have a lot of relatives that were veterans that served in Vietnam and in World War II and the Korean War. And, one thing my dad always taught me growing up is we'd be in the grocery store and he would go, if somebody was wearing a veteran's cap or hat or shirt or something, we'd go up to them and we would thank them. We'd intentionally say, thank you for your service. And we appreciate that. And so I think often, you've been in law enforcement. I think a lot of times the emotion is, we did it because we think it's, we're kind of like shepherds or sheepdogs. We think it's the right thing to do. That's not our motivation. So a lot of times when somebody comes up to you and says, hey, thanks for doing a great job, you're like, okay, I don't know how to handle this.
I'm just doing my job. I mean,
you're welcome.
Thank you.
Right. So from that standpoint, I think that she didn't know. I mean, it was obvious she didn't know who I was, other than the young guy that was always hanging out at the fire station and trying to be helpful and do things. But to me, it's interesting. I mean, she was appreciative, and she was kind of like, wow, I didn't, that was a long time ago and you still remembered. And so moving forward, I always, from that point forward, I always tried to remember, if I interact with somebody and thank them, I need to be sincere. I need to be honest, but at the same time, we don't hear that a lot. We don't hear, even in church safety today, I don't hear thank you often. But when I do, when I walk through the church as the church safety director, and someone comes up to me and says, hey, I just want to say thank you for how you serve in the ministry you serve in. It means a lot to me because, as you know, there are countless hours that go into things like that for training and practice and drills and all that sort of thing, that it's challenging.
Yeah, and You've had various different sort of volunteer positions, some EMS that have been paid and some true voluntary, and, you help out at your church. But if we particularly focus on when you're in EMS, I mean, I know you told me a story once that you literally had to climb over a cliff because a car had fallen off. And I mean, but that isn't an everyday job for anyone, I'm just trying to imagine you on a rope.
It's not.
being lowered down with a medical
right.
bag.
So I was just going to say that particular case, it was, and I used to do a lot of that stuff. Why, if a car, I've crawled into cars while they were on their side before or on the roof and not given it a second thought. And one of the reasons I kind of got out of it was because my doctor came to me and said, you're not a young guy anymore. And I was in my 30s and I'm like, I'm not old. And he's like, no, but
you do predate 911, you just said, James.
Yeah.
You're not a young man, but
my doctor at that point, a small farm community doctor, he was in his 70s and I'd known him all my life. And he's like, James, he's like, well, actually he always called me Jim. He's like, Jim, he's like, you need to start taking it easier on your body. And so I kind of backed away from it. But yeah, I was usually the first person. We had that in that one case, it was a minivan that slid off the road because of snow. And we were trying to get people were still caught in it. We're trying to get them out. And it was about 150 feet from the edge of the road, and it was a straight cliff. And the only thing that was holding this Dodge Caravan up to the road was a small oak sapling that was probably about that big. And we were getting people out, and we could see the van start shifting and the weight, from people moving. And so the fire chief yelled, we need to get the vehicle secured. And they said, well, it's a cliff. What are we going to secure it to? It's winter. There's, 10, 12 inches of snow on the ground. How are we going to do this? We need to do it now. And so what they did was they actually hooked up come-alongs to the rescue truck and to the fire chief's truck, and then threw it over the axle and strapped it. And then I just started going down the hill. I had no gear on or anything to try and get them out. And one of the assistant fire chiefs, who's actually my age and a friend of mine, threw me a rope. And so I'm holding onto this rope, and I grabbed the person just as the van shifted, and the straps held it. But I pulled the person out and kind of moved them up the side of the hill. And my rope started giving, and I can't get a step. My feet are starting to slide out from under me. And so I had that panic moment. I'm like, oh my goodness, this is going to end poorly.
I guess only me and you can laugh because we've worked in law enforcement and EMS.
Sure.
This is the sick humour that people say. But I guess in those moments, though, and James, so when they do happen, I know that you're a strong Christian man, of strong values. There are times when you're seeing things in society where either society says they're wrong, or we challenge why they happen. I mean, were there times where you might have seen some, I'm sure you can recount tales of some horrific injuries and some sad and tragic circumstances. Were you ever challenged in your faith, as in, why did God allow it to happen, or what does this mean? What did you pray from those incidents?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. One of the deciding factors, a lot of my experiences growing up, I was involved in the church, and I was very active with, we had a small church, and I was active with preaching. And I got to a point in my life where people were coming up to me and saying, you need to be a pastor, you need to be a preacher. And I was like, no, I'm not interested in doing that. And one evening, I don't think I wrote about this. I've written about a lot of the stories that happened, but one evening I responded with another friend of mine to a car accident. In the car accident, it was four individuals. They had been drinking at a party. They were teenagers, and they were driving excessive speeds through the back mountain roads of New Hampshire. And they came around a corner and went off the road and actually plowed into an oak tree and stone wall. And the oak tree was probably about the size of, I would say probably 4 or 5 feet in diameter. It was a massive tree. Well, before they hit that, before they accelerated, there was a guy, it was 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock at night, there was a guy that had been hitchhiking. And so they stopped and they picked him up. And he knew him from high school, but he hadn't been at the party. He hadn't been drinking. And he sat in the back seat, and he didn't have his seatbelt on. And so for me at the time, they crashed. My pager went off. I went, and I'm driving there. I knew right where it was. It was a true travesty. They had dispatched 4 or 5 ambulances. Ambulances were getting lost. They couldn't figure out where this back road was. So when we got there, we were the first ambulance in, and it was really crazy. I was pulled in 6 different directions at once, and at that point, for myself, I had gotten to the point where I was like really shutting God off. I was just like, I'm going to do my thing, what I want to do, and I'm not interested. So don't talk to me about this. I'm doing my thing. And so I walked up to the car. Well, the boy that had been hitchhiking that they picked up, when they hit the oak tree, actually went through. He wasn't wearing a seatbelt. He went through the dash into the engine compartment. And so when I walked up to the car, wow, I'm looking into the vehicle, and I can see the 4 individuals who were strapped in, and we're trying to cut part of the vehicle out to get them out. And my partner came up to me and he said, I want you to check for signs of life from the 5th boy. And I still to this day, I remember leaning in the driver's side window, and his body was in the engine compartment. So his legs and backside were where you would shift your car. And at that moment, I just closed my eyes, and I stepped back. I got really dizzy, and I stepped back and I looked up in the sky, and all I could see was black. We're in the middle of nowhere, right? No street lights, black, stars everywhere. A gorgeous, gorgeous night. And the only thing, opposite of that, obviously, was all the rescue equipment and the lights flashing and stuff. But I was staring up in the sky, and I said, God, if you're up there, I really need your help. And of course, I knew in the back of my mind that he was there. He never left me. I became a believer at an early age. But, I looked up and I saw that, and I said, okay, God, here's my test for you. I really need you to give me a clear mind and help me with this. And so I looked down, I took a deep breath, and I did what I was supposed to do. And, a peace just rolled over me. I can't even explain it. But honestly, I went home. 2 of the individuals were life flighted to local hospitals. 2 were transported. I transported one of them. All 4 of the individuals survived. And unfortunately, the one hitchhiking did not. And he was well known, and that really impacted the community hard. But when I got home, it was interesting. When I got home, I flipped my devotional calendar. I had a calendar on my dresser. I flipped it over, and there was a passage in Chronicles, chapter 20. And if you ever get a chance to read it, it's a great passage. It's about King Jehoshaphat in the Bible. And he was trying to do the best he could, and he had these armies come up from the middle of nowhere and just presented him with this ununderstandable war at his front door. And so the very first thing that he did was he prayed. He gathered the people together. He prayed. He asked God for help. And so I came home, and I'm like, okay, I'm exhausted mentally, physically, trying to get back into bed. I had been at that incident in the hospital for hours. And so I see this, and I read it, and I looked up the verse, and I said, in my bedroom, I sat there and I said, okay, God, whatever you want me to do, you got my attention. If you want me to go to college, if you want me to do this, whatever you want me to do, you make it happen, because I know that you can make it happen. And what was crazy is the very next Sunday, and I had no college money. I had no money in reserve or anything. And my parents weren't. Again, my dad is an engineer, a machinist. He's an engineer for Ruger now. He works for the firearms company. But at the time, he had probably a $15 an hour job. So there was no way that he was going to say, here's some money to help go to college or anything. It had never been an option for me. And so I went to church a couple days later, and I really wanted to share. And we had, remarkably circumstances, right? Providence, whatever. The speaker for that day didn't show up. And so they're like, we need a speaker. They're like, hey, James,
you're the guy.
So they grabbed me. So I went up there and I read the verse and I explained what happened in the mindset and the peace that God gave me. And I'm not making this stuff up. This is what really happened. I walked away after I was done preaching, walked away, and an older gentleman walked up to me and he said, James, he said, I want you to come over to my house this afternoon. And I said, why, sir? What do you need help with something? What can I do for you? And he's like, no, I want you to come over and I want to talk to you. I said, okay. So I drove over to his house and I was sitting on his porch drinking iced tea. And he said, I know you guys don't have a lot of money, but he said, God told me that I need to help you go to college. And he said, I think this is a good college and I'm going to help you go. And he said, I will pay for a third of it. He said, a third of it is your responsibility. And he said, I feel like a third of it is your parents' responsibility. And so I kind of looked at him and I said, and my brain just, just exploded. I said, why are you doing this? And he said, he said, I've seen in you what I haven't seen in my own family. He said, my son does not follow the Lord. And it turns out this man had established a chicken farm in Long Island, had extensive property in New York off Long Island, and he sold it and basically retired in Vermont, right near us. And his son went and did his own thing. And so he's like, you know what? He was not interested in the Bible. He wasn't interested in God. And he's like, I see an interest and a passion in you. And he's like, I want to help. And this is the last thing that he ever said to me. I want to help you out because you're going to do big things for God. And I just looked at him and I'm like, why would you say that? How do you know? And he's like, I just know this is what's going to happen. So he ended up in the whole stretch. And this was like 2 weeks it was probably about 4 weeks before college started. And so now all of a sudden I'm like, wow, maybe this isn't a possibility. Right. So in 4 weeks, I ended up selling a car. I went to college, I got a job. And the first year I walked in and I knew I was going to have a balance. I knew I was going to have to do a work program or something like that to pay for it. And I sat in the business administrator's office and I said, sir, I said, how much do I owe you? And he looked at the balance sheet and looked back at me and he said, Mr. McGarvey, you don't owe us anything. And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, well, let me double check. I said, I owe you money. And he's like, let me go check. So he leaves the room, comes back, and he said, no. He said, your account, he's like, there's actually a positive $300 in your account. And of course, that was 20 years ago, but the money, I think it was like $9,000 for the year. And of course, when you don't have anything, to me, I was like, that is a crazy large amount of money.
You said you're an old man, James. So if we're going back a long time, that must have been a lot of money.
But, I started crying. And the business administrator kind of looked at me and he said, are you okay? And I said, no, I'm not, because I can see the blessing of God. I said, 4 weeks ago, I would have never thought that this was going to happen. And 4 weeks ago, I was doing my own thing and it impacted me. And, going to college changed my life. I ended up actually getting a degree there 4 years and ended up meeting my wife there. And so the rest, as they say, is history.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that because, when I was phrasing that question for you, is that as an EMS, like you said, you've been dangling down the side of a cliff, or a caravan is about to fall off. You had some difficult things to overcome that you've seen. And it ties into a conversation I had with Williford a little while ago when I was sort of talking to him about, he was saying that post Sutherland Springs in 2017, he's had a lot of blessings. And he accounts those for God asking him to do something very difficult. Obviously, he had to engage a gunman and sort of fire back. And he said this is his reward for doing something challenging. So when I was asking you that question about being EMS, it was going to be, well, how are you dealing with the sort of stresses and strains of challenging? Well, God, why are people dying? Why are people in these situations? But there is a difference between the natural and the supernatural. You know, God can't define natural law. If you're not wearing a seatbelt, you're not wearing a seatbelt. You're going to go flying through the front. But it's interesting to hear how that you were really blessed through that situation of your service. So
I think it was honestly, I think it was interesting too, because often and we don't think, you know, even in church safety, a lot of times we don't think about how our actions impact others, right? And that ripple effect, or that 7 ways that this happens with this or whatnot. But what was interesting was when things happened that were bad, I started to develop a relationship with the other folks that were also responding. And so they would come to me and they would say, well, how are you handling this? And of course, you know, similar story to your story, but you know, there was nothing back then. You know, there was no counseling. There was no, you know, if you decided that you wanted to go get counseling to answer those questions or ask those questions, you were looked at as incompetent.
Yeah, right? I mean, I can remember as a police officer going to numerous horrific scenes, and it really was, you know, buck yourself up, Osamoh, and get out there. You know, there was no sympathy. Not that you expected sympathy, but it just wasn't there.
Sometimes, and what was crazy to me was, you know, whenever I came home from a call, my dad would always sit down with me, and maybe it was at the table over a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, but when I took my shoes off and hung up my gear, he would always say to me, "Do you want to talk about it?" And maybe that made the difference. And there were some days where I said, you know what, Dad, let's go walk outside around the garden, or let's go do something, because I do need to talk about it. And so, you know, my dad was always there for me. Other people saw, and I think to an extent, you know, that pushed me into, you know, I was the person, really the infant stages of being a chaplain, because I was the person that many came to and they said, well, you're handling this okay. How are you dealing with this? Let's talk about it. You know, and often the only thing I could say is, you know, I relate it back to, you know, regardless of what happens in my life or to me, I'm there to help. But, you know, my hope is in God, and my stability it's not that it doesn't impact me or it doesn't affect me. It's just that at the end of the day, I'm content knowing that God put me in that position to do the best I can. I did the best I could. And, you know, I move on from there. Do I still question stuff? Absolutely. I mean, as much as you know, I'm sure have, you know, gone back and questioned, did I do this right? And it kind of haunts you. There are things that haunt me still to this day, where I say, you know, 25 years ago, I did this. Could I have impacted this person? Could I have saved this person if I had done something just a tiny different? But, you know, again, at the end of the day, understanding that we love and serve a gracious God that puts us in situations and gives us mental strength and stability to make it through. That's really what I've kind of leaned on and gone back to. So
yeah, and I know, you know, you've had quite a varied career in different, you know, always servant focused, but a varied career in different things. And one of the things that you started to get into now are devotionals. So I know that you've just finished you got the 31-day devotional.
Yes.
And you're just working on a new devotional. And here you've got a nice foreword from someone well known. I don't know who that person is, but you know, it's.
I'm not sure.
Is it Simon Osamoh? Is that right? Well,
yeah.
It's now because you edit me out of the book, so you know if I say it, it becomes real. So, what led you to create these devotional books then?
Sure. Well, you know, the first one, War Ready, and that's available on Amazon. But War Ready was really a project that Paul Buckner and I both started, and Paul was really focused on encouraging and mentoring people in the physical ability, like get in shape, stay in shape, because there could be times when you're called to run across the street or run out to help somebody or physically exert yourself. So let's do it in baby steps, but stay in shape with a scripture reference and that sort of thing. And I started looking at that content and I said, you know what? There really isn't a lot out there. There's a lot of great book materials and books. Colonel Grossman has great books. Carl Chin has a great book, but it's really like, okay, this is how we did it. This is how you set up a safety team. That's it. There's very little out there to say, okay, I understand, I can empathize, I can understand where you're at because you're dealing with this right now, and I've dealt with it too. So let me tell you, let me try and encourage and disciple you. And so one day I started messing around with trying to put War Ready together and self-publish it. And we did, and Paul was like, "What are you doing?" He was blown away, and he still to this day says, that was all on you. You sat down, you organized it, you edited it, etc. It was really a joint effort. The new one that's coming out, The Road Less Traveled, is probably going to release sometime this week, but. I asked you to write the foreword for it, and you were far too generous.
You're committed now. It's in there.
You were far too generous and complimentary, but I liked, we've known each other for a little bit of time, and I've always liked the fact that you're ministry minded and you're focused on that. And
you don't have to say nice things about the host, James. That wasn't part of that's not part of it.
Well, I feel like we've become good friends. We've gotten along. You haven't sent any crazy drones to my house yet in Ohio or anything like that.
You know of, yeah.
That I know of, right? So, but realistically, the new one, The Road Less Traveled, is kind of a pun because growing up, I grew up in New Hampshire. Robert Frost is a famous American poet. He came from New Hampshire, and he has a book or poem entitled The Road Less Traveled. And that was one of my favorite poems, a very famous American literature. And so I used to study that and read that. And I always understood, when I read it, I always saw the spiritual implications of the road less traveled. And, as believers, often we take a smaller path, a path that's not always recognized, a path that people criticize us for sometimes. And I often felt like, with the safety team, we get a lot of criticism. Often, it's people think, oh, well, you're just playing security guard. You're not really impacting in an impactful way. And so to me, it was kind of a pun on words, but as I went through it, we did a 31-day approach. We took a 31-day approach. We added a journal concept. That was one thing that folks had asked us for, a place to journal. And then we also added a group study component where someone could do like a small group or a life group Bible study, and they would have the basis of asking questions that would maybe prompt some healthy discussion with, mental health and how does that impact you? How does leadership characteristics impact you? And that's all things we need to, honestly, with church safety, we need to consider and keep in mind that individuals are impacted by stuff in different ways. And I could have a mental ability to handle doing CPR on someone or, doing that methodically because I've done it before. But that doesn't mean that someone that has less experience could handle it the same way. And so often, the large experiences that we've dealt with afterwards, I've pulled my team aside and I said, okay, you know what? Nobody's paying attention. Nobody's listening. It's just me. I'm here. Let's talk about this. How did this impact you? How are you mental health wise? How are you coping? How are you handling this?
Yeah, and that's one of the big pieces which is missing. And I'm so pleased and excited for you to be releasing this. You know, I spoke to you during the week about it, and I wasn't joking, but this is a book that a lot of people that work within law enforcement and EMSs and just anyone in the public service really needs, because, you know, we can be in heightened, stressful situations and we need to take time to journal and reflect. So, James, very quickly before we wrap up, how can people get hold of you if they want to learn more about the Church Safety Guys?
Sure. Well, you can visit our website, is churchsafetyguys.com. We also have a Church Safety Guys Facebook page, and we have connections, you know, LinkedIn, Instagram, all that. I haven't moved to TikTok yet. I'm still trying to figure that one out.
Well, you said I think you're a bit too old for TikTok.
Maybe.
There's an limit on some of these. You'll be mentioning Snapchat in a second. So
there you go. Impacting a younger generation and preparing the next set of leaders. But you know, we do have the group Church Safety and Security on Facebook. That's definitely been probably the largest way, and certainly anytime someone, you know, you can email us through the website or that sort of thing, and reach out that way. But
James, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today, and thank you for sharing part of your journey. Take care.
Thank you for joining us for the Who I Became podcast. If you are enjoying the discussions between Simon and his guests, make sure to subscribe, rate, and review, as well as share with your friends on social media. Once again, thank you for joining the Who I Became podcast.